Let's get started because we've got a lot to cover today when we're obviously talking about oil today. So you all know I'm from Houston, Texas. The oil industry is very present and real when you live in Houston because it's such a large industry there. So I have my Houston Oilers hat on. I'm sure none of you know or remember who the Houston Oilers were, but this was our football team before they moved to Tennessee and became the Tennessee Titans. So it was Houston's football team back then, and so I was a Houston Oilers fan growing up. So just wanted to bring it in to make it some fun. And as we talk about fossil fuels, we're going to talk about coal on Friday. These are very present in different communities around our country. So you see that presence. The other thing that I have on today is I have my oil earrings on. So I have my oil derricks on. So just to remind you, this is how we find oil. We drill for it, we make the wells, and then we produce it, right, with our pump jacks. So you guys have already learned about this. So I've got drilling, pump jacks. Today we're going to talk more about the oil industry, the markets, how we move it around, and then how we make it into the fuels that we use, our gasoline, our diesels, our jet fuels, things like that. All right, so this is a picture from a field trip we used to go on. This was to the Valero refinery that is up in Benicia. So we have Chevron refinery in Richmond, Valero refinery in Benicia, some big oil refineries up in Northern California. And we're going to talk about some of those today and how those impact the fuels that we have in the region, and also fence line communities, air pollution, oil spills, things like that go along with having these big industrial sites in our area. All right, so I like to start off with some big questions. These are kind of things to think about. Not going to read through them here, but just things to think about when you're thinking about the oil industry. Where are we today? Why are we where we are? Where are we going in the future? So you've seen some readings and videos. Hopefully you got a chance to look at that. We're going to cover some more about refining, but watching those videos will really give you a little bit more detail. And thinking about the energy equity side of oil. So this longer article really talks about fence line communities in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and gives you a sense of the complexities for those fence line communities. So it's one of the challenges with these big industrial sites like oil refineries. And you've seen this chart before, just to kind of contextualize where we are today in this lecture. We're all the way down at the end. We're talking about now we've gotten the oil out of the ground. What do we do with it? How do we get it to the refineries? And how do we make it into the fuels that we use, especially in our transportation sector? So a little bit of summary of things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about crude oil. It's not all the same. So I'll give you a sense of what the differences are, what's the terminology we use when we talk about crude oil. We're going to talk about trade and moving it around. We move a lot of oil around. It is one of the resources that is very much a global commodity. So we have global prices on oil, a lot of factors that go into our global prices and our global markets for oil. And so we'll talk about that. But big picture, we move a lot of it around. Much of that transport is on water. That's just a sense that we're moving it across oceans as we move our oil around. It doesn't come out of the ground in a very useful form, so we're going to talk about refining. The products that we primarily make in the US are gasoline. That's not true everywhere, so we'll talk about some of the differences in the products. Why do we use oil for transportation? It is a very high energy density, both from a liquid, like a volume standpoint and a mass standpoint. And so when you're going to carry your fuel around with you like you do with transportation, that energy density is important. And so this is why oil has really dominated our transportation fuel sector. It makes it very hard to dethrone, to move to something else. And then we're obviously going to talk a lot about the environmental issues with our oil use. Some of these have already been touched on because they're upstream. So you guys saw that when we talked about drilling, and Jane talked about production. A lot of these legacy and current environmental issues. Today we're going to talk more about the air pollution and greenhouse gas emission piece of the environmental impacts from oil. So this is just our roadmap for today. We're going to start in the history and significance of markets, finish up kind of oil production, where we're going to talk about tar sands and oil sands, and then we're going to talk about moving our oil and refining our oil. So you've seen this before, but just to point out the oil piece of your pie for energy. Oil is the #1 energy resource, both in the world and the US. And that is pretty much all used for transportation. And you can kind of see that when you look at the electricity generation pie charts. Really, oil falls to number 6, number 8. It's not a big piece of electricity generation. It's too valuable to use for electricity generation. We could use it to produce electricity, same way we do with coal. But it's too valuable. It's much more valuable as a transportation fuel. And so that's where it really dominates the market. So for the US, and this is just giving you an example of how oil really goes through our economy and dominates our transportation sector. So there's a few things I want you to take from this Sankey diagram of oil in the US. First, looking at where we get our oil from, so our crude oil supply. We're going to talk more about this, but this picture has really changed with the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing revolution. We used to import more like 3/4 of our oil, and now we're only importing about 1/3 of our oil. And not only that, we're exporting quite a bit of oil. We originally, for a long time, we were not able to export crude oil. It wasn't allowed by our federal government. That changed in 2015. It was kind of like a deal when we were expanding some of the subsidies on renewables. The way some of the Democrats got Republican Party to support that was to allow exporting of crude oil. For a long time, it wasn't allowed because of energy security. It was this idea that we should keep our oil within our borders. But now we allow crude oil exports. We've always allowed refined product exports, so that means things that are coming out after we've already made the gasoline or diesel. We export that. And those two wedges are actually bigger than our crude oil import wedge. So in just the last 3 years, we have become a net exporter of oil, crude oil plus products. It's a new landscape for the US. But you can see we also still use quite a bit of it here. Just much more crude oil production is coming domestically than from foreign sources. Then you can see I want to show you the end, right? So 3/4 of it, or 2/3 of it is really going to transportation. And then that industrial piece, which is almost another 1/3, 30%, about half of that is fueling the refineries that is making the transportation fuels. And so a big wedge is going to transportation, other industrial parts that is used for heating and some other processes, and it's also used for non-fuel purposes. Oil goes into plastics and other commodities, so in chemicals as well. So this chart's not going to surprise you. World oil production is growing, and it's growing as demand grows. And so where are those growth areas in production? You can see really in this chart how production really took off in North America and the US with the horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing revolution. Middle East very much dominates oil production, and not a lot of growth in other areas for production. So those are the two big regions of oil production today. And new oil and gas projects continue to come online. So this is just one example, the Willow project. It's gotten a lot of press because of the controversy there. I would say projects in Alaska have a long history of controversy. ANWR is a reserve there. There's been a lot of pushback. There's a big oil reserve there. A lot of pushback. It's a very environmentally sensitive area, and it's actually a very challenging area to produce oil. And so Willow Project has some of those same challenges. Although this is now leased, there's still question on whether it will actually be produced, and that depends a lot on oil demand and oil price. It's like I said, it's a little bit more challenging area, and so that impacts the profit margins for producing from this site. But it's just to give you a sense, and this chart is showing you new oil and gas projects, just to give you a sense that we are continuing to drill and go after new oil and gas plays. Okay, so the US and what our role is. We are the #1 oil producer and the #1 oil consumer in the world. And so we're showing these in these two charts. This is world oil production, and that's world oil consumption. And you can see that we're about 20% on both of those charts. Now, if you remember, and Jane talked about this in Intro to Fossil Fuels, our oil reserves aren't very big, though. We only have about 4% of the oil reserves in the world. We're just producing a lot more of it. So we've gone after more of those plays. It's a very different environment than it is in a lot of other countries. In the US, it is very much market-driven, commercial-driven. There's private ownership of minerals, and so there's a lot of incentives to go after those minerals with those private mineral rights. In much of the rest of the world, those mineral rights are owned by the government. It's much more of government-controlled industry than here is in the US. Other things that I just put up here to kind of give you a sense, in case you haven't heard some of these acronyms. OECD is often considered kind of most of the developed world. You can see it consists of about 36 countries, and sometimes there's this comparison about the developed world and what their share is versus OPEC, which is the petroleum exporting countries. And so you can see in terms of production, pretty big share of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, 36%. OECD has grown since the US wedge has grown to about 30%. So that used to be a much bigger difference in terms of production. And then consumption is very much in the OECD countries. So OPEC gets a lot of attention as well. So this is an organization that has 13 member countries, but it also has what they call OPEC Plus, which are additional countries like Russia that they often work together with. And their goal here is to control production in order to influence oil demand and oil price. So sometimes they do it to make price go up, so they're reducing production. Sometimes they do it to increase market share, where they're lowering oil price. And we've seen both of these things in play. When the horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing revolution really started to take off in the US, OPEC really opened the taps, increased production, and tried to drive out some of those smaller companies in the US because they were producing from harder, more expensive plays than what, for instance, Saudi Arabia could produce. Saudi Arabia is obviously a big producer within this organization, often seen as a swing producer. So they have what we're going to talk about, where they have a very light, sweet crude, very easy to kind of turn on and off their taps. And so because they have a lot of oil and because they have very easy to produce oil, they can really influence the market by how much they're producing and how much they're taking offline. So really seen as a swing producer, and that can impact oil prices. But as other countries like the US, at least right now, are producing more, they have less influence on oil price than before. One of the things about oil, which we're going to see is different from things like coal or biomass, is that it is concentrated in just a few areas. It is not evenly widespread as a resource around the world. And you would think that if you have oil in your country, a lot of time that would lead to wealth or the ability to produce this oil and have a good exporting commodity for your country. Well, one of the things that we actually see is something called a resource curse. It's called a resource curse. In some of the countries that are actually oil exporters, a lot of times that oil is only supporting the government, a wealthy few. It's not actually supporting the masses. And it can have a significant impact on how much other investment in the country goes on for other commodities, other things to export. And so one of the regions I really want to point up is that's getting a lot of attention right now is Nigeria, for example. So you can see this is showing you, the revenues in terms of exports. So what this chart is really showing you is that Nigeria is very dependent on oil exports for much of the country's revenue. And a lot of that doesn't trickle down to the populace. It supports a wealthy few. And so that can be this challenge in terms of how equitable a society is with this resource curse idea. And so this is really coming up as oil companies that have operated in places like Nigeria, like Shell, for example, this is just an example that's been recently in the news, is trying to sell off of its more polluting areas. So it's trying to sell off some of its more polluting oil sites, trying to reduce carbon footprint in that way. And in Nigeria, there often is a lot of flaring. There's often a lot of oil leaks. So it tends to be a very polluting place for some of these multinationals to work. And so Shell, for example, has sold off much of its assets in Nigeria to local producers. Well, the unintended consequence of that is the local producers don't have the money or the resources to clean up, and so the pollution has actually gotten worse. And so this, again, is just another impact of our use of oil as a fossil fuel. The other thing that's going on, at least has been talked about with a lot of the big oil company multinationals, is this idea that they're investing in clean energy. They're trying to diversify and reduce their carbon footprint in that way. And so this chart is just to give you a sense that it's still not anywhere near the investment that they're putting into their oil and gas assets, right? It's not surprising. That is what they are. They might talk about being energy companies, but they're really oil and gas companies. And as long as we have demand for these products, they're going to see that that's where a lot of the profits lie. That's where their expertise lies. That's where a lot of their investment is going. So I just wanted to bring up another complexity of oil before we really get into the technology and stuff. And that is oil's impact on climate change and the attention that some of the oil companies, ExxonMobil in particular, has gotten a lot of attention about this idea that they've known about climate change for a long time, and they've tried to downplay it. So this is something that New York State has done a lot of investigation in. California has just recently sued oil companies, ExxonMobil just being one of them, so there's a whole list of oil companies that they're suing, really with this evidence that they've known about climate change for a long time and tried to downplay it so they could continue with their oil business. And so this is going on a lot in the news. Why does it matter? If you look at the energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, oil obviously is a big wedge. So you can see it's almost a third of the energy-related greenhouse gas emissions today. And much of that, I would say most of that, is from using the products, right? So yes, oil companies have greenhouse gas emissions from drilling for oil, producing oil, refining oil, but most of the greenhouse gas emissions come from burning the gasoline, the diesel, the jet fuel that they produce, right? So it's on the consumer side of things. And so one of the back and forths have been is a oil company's carbon footprint include all of the fuels that are being burned, or is it just their operations? And so you'll see that in the media, and as there's this tug of war on reducing their carbon emissions, how much responsibility they have of the product actually releasing those greenhouse gas emissions. So the other thing that's in the media a lot is oil price. Why? Why do we talk about oil price so much in the media? Yes, it is absolutely important. It drives the price of all sorts of other things, including inflation, right? What else? Yeah, it changes a lot. We see it go up and down. That is something that has really started since the 70s. Before the 70s, it was pretty stable. But since the 70s, it changes a lot. Yes, absolutely. So for a lot of oil exporting countries, it is a big part of their revenue, their income, absolutely. Yeah, some countries' currencies depend on the oil price, their value, for sure. Here in the US, right, it is very political. People pay attention to gas prices way more than they pay attention to the price of milk, right? It's very present and real, and so it has a long history of being important politically in the US, is gas prices, and how people feel about the economy is very related to gas prices, right? So it is important. I would also say that, and that kind of relates to your point about it impacting the price of other things, our economy is very impacted by the price of oil because it's so important for transportation of ourselves and our goods. And so we see that impact on consumers, on people. Low-income families in particular tend to have a very high percentage of their income devoted to transportation needs. And so they're very price sensitive in terms of gasoline prices. So it's very impactful for our economy. And as you guys mentioned, it goes up and down quite a bit. So if you looked at historically before the 70s, it's pretty stable. 1970s was a big deal because of the Arab oil embargo. What was that? What was the Arab oil embargo? Anybody know what was going on then?
It was in response to the Arab-Israeli war.
That's exactly right. It was in response to that conflict. And so this was a big shock around the world in terms of, it was kind of like a wake-up call of how dependent our economies were on oil. And so in the US, we freaked out. We thought we were going to run out of oil, and then there were long lines at gas stations and things like that. There was a lot of concern, and it prompted a lot of policy. In the US, we focused on, it was the first time we put in place fuel economy standards on our cars because of that Arab oil embargo. Brazil focused on making ethanol and switching from gasoline to ethanol so they could get off of oil for their transportation system, because ethanol is very domestically produced in Brazil. France said, let's go nuclear, and really focused on getting oil out of their electricity system and focusing on nuclear power for their system. So those are just some examples, but that single event and that was like a wake-up call about how impactful oil price was to economies around the world, and really changed the trajectory of a lot of different energy systems because of that single event. And then you can see how conflicts in the Middle East, especially, but other things really impact oil price. So it's very sensitive to these big geopolitical events. The latest, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was very impactful to oil price. And then we were just talking about today that the conflict in Gaza also, we already saw oil prices go up because of that conflict. We're not really sure where it's going to end up. Like I said, it depends a lot on sanctions and how things go forward. Very dependent on these big geopolitical events. Those aren't the only things that impact crude oil prices, but they're some of the biggest. If you want to get more into this, the EIA kind of has this map of 7 factors that influence it. Obviously, it's supply and demand. So things that can affect it locally are like safety events, if there's a safety event at a refinery, hurricanes, natural disasters that cause refineries to shut down. Things like that can really impact regional oil prices as well. So we'll zoom in on the Ukrainian example because I think oil was a big part of it. We talked about how natural gas was really impacted and led to the increase of LNG exports from the US to Europe, for example. Oil was also a big part of this because a lot of Russia's revenues are coming from their selling of oil. And so you can see this is from 2022 when sanctions were put in place basically to price control on Russian oil. What the attempt was by Europe and the US in support of that was to keep Russian oil cheap so that they're not making a lot of revenue on the oil they do sell. That was the attempt. And so you can see the countries that were backing that sanction and then the countries that weren't and are continuing to just buy that oil. India is one example where it is really grown. It's buying that cheap oil off of Russia and taking advantage of those price caps on the Russian crude. So there's questions about really if this is working or not. And it is very hard to price control from one country on such a global commodity unless all the countries in the world are on board with that. So there's a question on whether this is really having a significant impact on Russia's revenues or not. But it is one way that, again, oil and its importance is countries are trying to influence price to influence the outcome of some of these conflicts. All right, so in the US, one of the things that was prompted after the Arab oil embargo was having a strategic petroleum reserve. What that is storage of oil. So we have these big salt domes that are down along the Gulf Coast. A salt dome or a salt cavern is an underground cavern that was filled with salt, and you can basically, you dissolve the salt out of it and it leaves this big salt dome cavern that you can store liquids in. We use these all the time for industrial storage. So this is just one time when we're using it for oil. When I worked at Dow Chemical, we used it to store all sorts of things, all sorts of different petrochemicals in these large caverns, kind of like natural storage facilities. And so we have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that is supposed to store about 35 days of supply of oil to let us ride out some of the extremes in prices. That is the idea. The challenge is we can only get it out so fast, and we can only produce it into refined fuel so fast, and then we can only move it around so fast. So how useful it really is to help us ride out if there was an extreme oil supply challenge or extreme high prices, it's a little bit in question, but that's the goal. And so we do see different federal administrations sometimes fill it up when the oil is cheap, and then they sell it when the oil is expensive. So it does work as kind of an arbitrage way of making some money off of that oil stored in these caverns. So you can see it's kind of at a lowish point in terms of how much we have in our Strategic Petroleum Reserve right now. Questions on that before we're going to get into moving it around and how we make it into fuel?
Are there any risks of groundwater contamination with these salt caverns?
I would say there's always risk. Salt caverns tend to be pretty airtight, but they have to be monitored because absolutely there's always risks of seepage or something like that. The biggest challenge we had when we used the salt caverns in the facility I was at, because we actually just stored salt water there. We were using it to make chlorine, is it mixing with other things that were stored in the neighboring caverns. And so you could sometimes get leakage across the caverns because you don't just always store the same thing in one cavern. Sometimes you change out what you're storing there. And so you can see some of that impact. Yeah.
Are there any concerns of the oil getting contaminated within the salt cavern?
No, it isn't. It isn't a huge concern. You're going to refine that oil as you take it back out and process it. So the little bit of salt that might get in there or something isn't something they worry about. Let's talk about oil sands and tar sands, and then we'll talk about moving oil around. So you've already heard a lot about how we drill and produce oil that's kind of conventional oil or unconventional oil that's in oil shale, stuff that's liquid at room temperature. Much of the oil that's produced in Canada, for example, is oil sands or tar sands. Sometimes it's called bitumen. You could either think of it as it's like pre-oil, it's not quite oil, or it's overcooked oil. It went too far in the kitchen. You overcooked it, and so you kind of burned off all the good stuff, and it's really tarry, thick stuff. So this is oil that doesn't move around at room temperature. It's very solid. And so we have to do stuff to it, extra stuff to it, even to just get it to move, to get it to the refinery, to do extra stuff to it to make fuels. Much more energy intense oil to make the fuels, the gasoline, the diesel, and the jet fuels that we want. Okay, so where is a lot of our heavy and oil sands and extra heavy oil resources? Much of them are in Venezuela and Canada. You know, a couple decades ago, they wouldn't even be considered proved oil reserves because if the oil prices goes low enough, it's not cost effective to produce that oil because of all the extra stuff you have to do to it. California oil also can fall into this category. Much of our California oil is heavy oil. It's really hard to produce. It's gunky. We have to do stuff to it. So we talk about going to San Ardo. That is a place where it is very thick, gross oil. So I'm just going to go ahead and talk about this a little bit. Okay, so this is what you get out of the ground at San Ardo. This is a heavy oil. It's not tar sand. It's a little better than tar sand, but it's a very heavy oil. And you can see most of what they get out of the ground is water. And so we joke that San Ardo is a wastewater treatment plant that has a byproduct of oil because they have to deal with all this yucky water, which they just inject back into the ground somewhere else, right? So this is very thick, gross oil. Gives you a sense of what we have in California and what we have in Venezuela. All right, so that's the heavy stuff that we're talking about. Canada it's even thicker stuff. Much of it is in Alberta, although they have other locations of this really heavy oil. There's two ways to get it out. Open pit mining, which is really you just clear the land, you clear the topsoil, you start digging out the sand and the oil that's mixed together. Then you got to heat it up to try to separate those things, and then you got to heat it up enough to make it into like a synthetic crude that you can at least pump somewhere or keep heated as you're pumping. So that process, usually they use natural gas to provide a lot of the heat for that process, so they have to pipe in natural gas to heat up that oil to make it into the Syncrude so they can move it around. In situ is where you're injecting the heat directly into the sands and trying to make it flow there, and then you pump it out kind of like you do with conventional oil because you've already heated it up. That's kind of what we do here in California with the heavy oil resources. We're putting steam into the ground, heating it up so it'll flow, and then we pump it out like conventional oil. It's causing a lot of challenges, environmental challenges in terms of oil sands. So as you can imagine, it's pretty land and water impactful where you have to clear the forest, clear the topsoil, and dig out the oil in Canada to get to the oil sands. And it's over massive areas of Alberta, for example. It's got a lot of water requirements, so you're making steam in order to get that oil to flow. And so you get a lot of gunky water as you're doing this process. And so they have a lot of these big wastewater tailing ponds that they have to do something with. And so this is just showing you a recent article. This is from this summer, talking about that they want to flush that wastewater into the rivers and the environment because it's just collecting. It's got a lot of stuff in it, so they're trying to figure out how can they process it, make it cleaner so that they can put it back into the environment rather than just kind of these waste pits of oil. In terms of the energy intensity, so it's basically to produce 5 barrels of oil, you need to burn a barrel of oil. And so that's why I'm saying this is very energy intensive oil. That means it's very greenhouse gas emission intensive because it has all the requirements for heat to make that oil flow. Keystone Pipeline got a lot of attention a few years ago, and much of it was because it would be removing this oil sands from Canada down to the Gulf Coast in the US, where we have a lot of refining capacity that would be able to process this oil. And so that was a lot of the controversy around that pipeline and basically supporting that use of oil sands. So this is just a picture from National Geographic kind of showing before and after of what oil sands looks like. All right, Let's move on to transportation of our oil. There's two main ways that we move our oil around. Tanker, so you can see that up in the upper corner, and pipeline. So tanker obviously over water, pipeline over land. I like to show this graph of this pipeline in Alaska. It was intentionally made elevated so it wouldn't impede the migration of the caribou. And so you can see the caribou are able to go under this pipeline. Pipeline infrastructure in Alaska can be very challenging, and there's a lot of inspections going on because as the permafrost melts, you can get shifts in these pipelines, and it can make it more prone to leakage. So just like we see challenges with roads in Alaska, we see challenges with pipelines because of the shifting ground as the permafrost melts. I said this already, but just to drive home the point that oil is a global commodity. We move it around. And much of what we do is we move the crude oil around. So we get the crude oil out of the ground, we move it closer to the markets where it's going to be sold, then we refine it near those markets to make the fuels that are in demand in those markets. So this very colorful chart is showing you which regions are exporting. This is just for crude oil, and which regions are importing. And so you can kind of squint and see who are the major exporters and who are the major importers for different countries. So some big ones to point out, obviously the Middle East is the biggest region of exporters for oil. You can see a lot of that is going to Asia. So Japan, India, Asia Pacific, China, a lot of dependence on Middle Eastern oil for those growing economies. We've talked about this before, but you can see that big wedge from Canada to the US. Much of our imported oil is from Canada with a variety of other locations. Over here in this chart, I'm showing you net import and exporting countries or regions. This is for both crude oil and refined products. So about half of the crude oil supply we move around, about a quarter of refined products, so that's our gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, is also moved around between countries. So this chart includes both of those, both crude oil and refined products. And you can see we are very recently, as I said, on this net exporting chart. We've been a net importer for a long time. It's only in the last 3 years that we've become a net exporter. You can see biggest net importing regions, Europe and China, biggest net exporters, Middle East and Russia. So this is just zooming in on the US. So we've got 3 different lines here. The net crude oil is that red one. The net products, the refined products, is that pink one. And the blue is the combination of the two. And so we're down there right at the 0 mark where we're a net exporter in the last 3 years. Okay, so let's talk about moving it around by water. So of the oil that we move around, remember that's half the crude oil, 2/3 of that is moved around on water. And so we're using ships to do that. There's a couple of organizations, international and US, that govern those ships that we're moving oil around on. MARPOL is important. They just recently made requirements on reducing the sulfur emissions from our tankers that are moving across the ocean. Sulfur becomes sulfur dioxide when you burn high sulfur fuels, causes acid rain. It's a bad air pollutant, and so often the oil that we're burning in the tankers is kind of the worst of the worst. It's like we call it the bottom of the barrel. It's like the gunky stuff. It's not as refined as the gasoline and diesel. They use bunker fuel. And so it's much more polluting than the things that we put into our vehicles. And so they're starting to crack down on that because that air pollution does impact, it moves, right? It doesn't stay just where it's emitted. Those tankers come into port. It does impact people and communities. And so MARPOL is really the one that's on reducing the pollution from tankers. how big are these tankers? So growing up in Houston, we had a little boat. We would go out in our boat and we could go up the Houston Ship Channel next to these big tankers. They're coming in all the time. And you could see, you know, dolphins riding little waves next to the tankers. But to give you a sense of how big some of these tankers are, I mean, this is just showing you next to some buildings, how that's one of the largest tankers ever built. These are very large tankers, especially for the crude oil tankers that are moving it across the ocean. And so you can see there's different categories. These crude oil, these ultra-large crude carriers and very large crude carriers, they're going across the oceans, and they're called dirty tankers because they haven't been refined yet. It's the crude oil that we've gotten out of the ground. The challenge with those is that they can't go through some of the canals. So Suez, Panama, if you want to go through the canals, you've got to have smaller tankers. And so if you don't want to have to go all the way around South America or all the way around Africa, you have to have smaller tankers. And so that's where we see some of these middle ones. The Panamax is called Panamax because it can make it through the Panama Canal. Those can either be for crude oil or refined products. You don't see the same on the same tanker. Often it's either crude oil or it's a bunch of different refined products in its tank holds. And the refined product ones often are smaller because you're not going as far. We're moving that regionally rather than globally like we are the crude oil. Those are called clean tankers. So that's where it's going to have your refined products. All right, risk with moving our oil around obviously is oil spills. So one of the most famous, I would say, and impactful tanker spills was the Exxon Valdez in Alaska in 1989. It was impactful for a number of reasons. One is this is in a very environmentally sensitive area, so we saw a lot of impact on the wildlife, the people, the fish, you know, whales, everything else in that area. It's also a very challenging place to clean up oil because it's in Alaska. And so that also made it very challenging. Another way it was impactful is it changed the rules about oil tankers. So at the time, these are what were called single hull tankers. So that meant that the container for holding the oil in the tanker was the outside of the boat, of the tanker. And so if you got a puncture, you were going to drain that whole cavity, right? What we now require, and if you saw the video, they talked about this, is double-hulled tankers. And so that means that there's a space, there's a gap between the outside of the tanker and the hold that's actually holding the oil inside the tanker. And so this dramatically reduces the risk of those tanker oil spills and was prompted because of Exxon, the Exxon Valdez spill, and passing of this Oil Pollution Act, where the US basically said, we're not going to allow any tankers to come to our ports unless they're double-hulled. And so that really prompted a change in the tanker industry. Much of the tankers that are in use today are fairly old. These aren't replaced often and quickly. And so many of them are, 20 years or more older. And so you can imagine that that impacts the engines, how efficiently they run, things like that in some of these old tankers. So the good news is our global oil tanker spillage volume has come down over time. It's gotten cleaner and cleaner over time. And this is pretty dramatic considering that over the same period of time, the amount of oil we traded doubled. So as we're moving more oil around, we're spilling less of it. So this is a good news story that we've gotten better. Woo, right? We've gotten better at this. So about 0.001% of the global oil transported is spilled. Still can be very impactful locally, right? It's a risk of using oil. How do we clean it up? So this is just giving you some ideas of the cleanup process. So oil is lighter than water. It will float-ish. So the first things we do is we put out booms. We try to collect it. Sometimes we try to burn it off of the top of the water. But depending on how rough the water is, it's going to start mixing. And so it can get pretty challenging. You can put surfactants in there that will surfactant's just a soap that will naturally trap the oil and then try to clean up. There's surfactant plus the oil. There's bacteria that they put out sometimes that eats oil to try to clean it up. The big thing is that like the sooner you act, the better. You act right away, that's the best. But you can only do so much. You're not going to get 100% of the oil back. And so it's going to impact the local environment, wash up on shore, things like that.
If there's an oil spill in a place with cold water, would that be different than an oil spill in a place with warm water?
Yeah, well, that's just one of the factors, really, because it can depend on how rough it is. In terms of cleanup, part of the challenge with Alaska was getting people and supplies and things to such a remote location.
Won't the oil hold together better with more cold water?
It will be thicker. It should stay thicker, but it also depends on the quality of that oil. If it's light sweet, it won't get as thick as like the heavy. So it depends some on the quality of oil as well as the temperature. So the other way we move oil around is by pipeline. And so this is really when we have the pipeline available and we're moving it over land, we're going to move it by pipeline. It's the cheapest way to move our oil around if the infrastructure exists. If the infrastructure doesn't exist, then we're moving it by truck or train, which is a lot more expensive. And so in the US, we have a pretty extensive pipeline, both for crude oil and for products, that we can move oil around. So you can see domestically, we're getting much of our oil to our refineries by pipeline. Even for foreign, a lot of that pipeline movement is from Canada. Right? So the oil we're getting from Canada is by pipeline. The other countries are getting it by tanker. Some of the same risks, right, with pipelines. So we see pipeline ruptures, we see breaks in pipelines that, again, can cause oil spills in natural environments or in communities. So these are just some examples. There's lots of examples of oil pipelines busting and impacting communities. And so some of the same challenges with cleaning up that oil from those oil spills. And I would say I don't have the data, but pipeline spills haven't changed a whole lot. So we saw tanker spills come down dramatically. Pipeline spills aren't going up, but aren't going down either. They're kind of holding steady in terms of the number of pipeline spills we have. All right, let's talk about refining. So this is a picture of the oil refineries. Each of those little boxes are an oil refinery in the United States. Much of our oil refining capacity is in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you can see the cluster of oil refineries there, especially in Texas and Louisiana. That red bar, it just shows that much of our oil refining capacity is in the Gulf of Mexico, very concentrated. The challenge with that is that that area of the US is prone to hurricanes. And so hurricanes actually have a big impact on our fuel production and often on price of gasoline in the United States, because it's going to cause a lot of those refineries to shut down. Okay, so refining capacity in the world. Big picture, what I want you to take from this is a lot of the refining capacity is where the markets are. So we are refining our oil where the demand for that oil is, or very close to it. We don't move the refined products as far. And so we've got a lot of refining capacity in Asia Pacific, a lot in North America, much less in places like the Middle East, where they're mostly exporting that oil to other markets. Right? In terms of the US, here I've broken it down by a company. In terms of refining capacity, a lot of times people are surprised to see who kind of leads this. Because it's not necessarily who you associate with who you're buying gasoline from at the pump. So a lot of our oil companies are refining only. Marathon, Valero, these only do refining. And then ExxonMobil, Chevron, they do all of it. They do the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. They do refining as well. And so there are different parts, different oil companies, whether they're vertically integrated or just focusing on refining. I worked at a refinery for a summer in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at the ExxonMobil refinery for a summer. And One of the things to keep in mind about refineries is, unlike the upstream, refining is a very tight margins business. So what does that mean? They're squeezed between the price of the crude oil and the price of gasoline. So they're only making pennies on the gallon, and so it has to be a volume business to make money. They're not making much on each gallon, but they are producing so much efficiently that they are able to make profit. In the oil industry, they kind of always talked about the upstream is kind of where the money is. You know, you're finding it and you're getting crude oil and stuff like that. Refining is very tight margin, part of the downstream of oil companies. So you have to be very efficient to make oil in the refining area. The number of refineries in the US are declining. And so what I want you to look at first is this blue line. We kind of peaked in terms of the number of refineries that were operating in our country in the 80s and have been declining ever since. So while we are declining, while we are closing refineries, we are still increasing our refining capacities. So what does that mean? We're closing smaller ones, we're closing less efficient ones, we're increasing the capacity at the bigger ones. All of those closed refineries are legacy environmental issues. So they are at best a brownfield site for something else. At worst, they end up on our Superfund list and become on our national priorities list and become a cleanup challenge for the government. And so you can see we have a lot of closed refineries around the country that pose this kind of environmental legacy challenge. Our average refining capacity and our total refinery capacity has continued to grow. So just think fewer, bigger, still have a lot of capacity for our refined products. All right, I'm going to bring it down to California for a minute because we're here in California. So we're going to talk about California for a minute. For California, we do not have a lot of pipelines that come into our state, either for crude oil or for refined products. So when you talk to people in the oil industry here in California, they call us like an oil island. We do not benefit from the crude oil that's being produced from the horizontal drilling hydraulic fracturing revolution, the rest of the country. We can't import that. There was some look at importing it by train through Lake Tahoe. There was a lot of pushback on that, so that was stopped, right? So we don't get oil in from the US from that way. We do have a pipeline from Alaska, so we can get some Alaskan crude oil into the US, or into California, but much of it's coming in through tanker to California. And then all of the oil that we use in California, all the refined products we use in California are refined here in California. So you can see we have these kind of clusters of refineries, much of them in Northern California and Southern California near the markets where there's a lot of fuel demand. So where are we getting our crude oil supply? As Alaska's crude oil production has declined over time, we're getting it more and more from foreign sources. Again, because we can't really get it from the rest of the US. So we have some domestic supply that's declining. As you can see, it's not the highest quality oil. We're getting it more and more from foreign sources. The mix of foreign sources kind of changes year to year. It's very market driven, right? So these are just the individual refineries buying oil on the market. They're just finding good prices for the types of oils that they can use in their refineries. So this mix changes year to year, changes a lot. It's not like a cohesive strategy or anything. All right, and why do we talk about California? California is a huge gasoline market. We're a large economy, we have a lot of people, and we move around a lot. So if California was a country, we would be number 3 in terms of world gasoline markets after the rest of the United States and China. Okay, so we are a huge gasoline market. Our fuels are a little different. So because of the air quality challenges, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, that we have in California, we have a lot more restrictions. And so we force those refineries to make cleaner fuels. They're cleaner burning fuels. They call them boutique fuels because they have to make a special blend just for California to meet our air quality and air pollution standards. So it drives up the cost. It requires more processing for our fuels. The other challenge that we see is if there is a challenge at one of these refineries. We've seen like a safety challenge or something where a refinery shuts down. Dramatically increases prices for gasoline in California because it's really hard to get that gasoline in from other refining capacity like in the Gulf of Mexico. So back to big picture. Let's talk about oil and how we talk about oil. So there's kind of three labels, categories when you talk about crude oil. You talk about the gravity of the oil, so this is like how thick is it. You talk about the sulfur content, and you talk about where it's from. And that's how we label our oil. So the gravity, if it's light, it has a high gravity. If it's light, that's like really runny. That's really like nice, high quality oil. If it's low or heavy, that's thick. That's the stuff we're getting out of San Bernardino, right? That's the stuff that barely flows. So that's low quality, tends to be cheaper. So cheaper to get the heavy than the light, right? Sulfur content, just like we saw with natural gas, it's sweet if it has a low sulfur content. It's sour if it has a high sulfur content. So high sulfur oil is also going to be cheaper. You have to do more to get that sulfur out. So that's going to be cheaper than sweet. So you're going to see like light sweet crude is usually more valuable than heavy sour crude. And then we talk about the geographic location. So I've boxed two of these, the Brent and WTI West Texas Intermediate. These are often seen as the, like, when you talk about the price of crude oil, these are the benchmarks. These are the ones that are the benchmark of the price of crude oil that we see in the market. We usually talking about Brent in Europe or West Texas Intermediate in the US as our benchmark crude oil prices. And you can see they're on the light sweet side of things. Very, very good oil. And you can see kind of the range of different locations of the different types of oil. All right, so the refineries are processing that into the fuels that we want. And what are they doing? Oil is this mixture of all sorts of different things, and they're making it into the products that are basically the length of the hydrocarbons that we want for our different fuels. Refineries are made to process certain types of crude oil. And so a refinery, a simple refinery might only be able to process the light sweet stuff, which is fairly easy. Other refineries may be set up to process the heavy, sour crude oils. And they can usually only operate in a certain range of crude oil that you're putting into the refinery. So what do? They call this the crude blending. And so this is just an example it's an actual example from Valero of the sulfur content and the API gravity of all these different crudes that they're buying. And they have to blend them together to be in this little box, because each refinery kind of has its mix that its refinery is set up to operate. So if you have a refinery that only operates on the light sweet crude and you want to start operating and be able to take in the heavy sour crude, you have to do a lot of changes to the equipment in the refinery to make that happen. It doesn't just switch. So it takes a lot of capital investment. And so usually they just kind of stay in their box in terms of the type of crude that they're operating. And so you can see they're buying stuff outside their box and just blending it together, and that depends on the price. So oil, if you talk to them, the oil is traded on its way here. They're buying and selling it while it's on the tanker on its way to California. The market is ongoing until you actually are offloading it into your refinery. Okay, so refining processes, I put it into 5 big categories of what we're doing. And if you watched the video, you saw some of this. First, we're distilling it. Then we're often cracking it, breaking apart some of the big molecules to make them smaller. We're taking sulfur out because we don't want sulfur in our fuels. We have low sulfur requirements for our fuels for air pollution reasons. We're reforming it, alkalization. This is really just making different shapes of molecules. We're putting some of it back together in different shapes, often for octane. And then they do blending so that they can get the exact mix that they want. So they're blending different streams to get the product they want. So let's take deeper into each of these. So it starts with distillation. And so what we're doing with distillation is we're heating up that crude oil and allowing it to separate by the vapor pressure of the different chains of hydrocarbons in that oil. So the really little stuff, the really light stuff, will end up at the top of the distillation tower, and the really heavy, thick, really big hydrocarbons will end up at the bottom. So I talked earlier about the bottom of the barrel. That's what we're talking about, is like this really heavy, thick stuff. That's going into asphalt, also goes into oftentimes like bunker fuel and things like that for marine purposes. You can see gasoline is kind of up towards the top, jet fuel in the middle, diesel is a little heavier cut of your distillation tower. All right, so that's the first process. There are some refineries that are just this. This would be the simplest refinery, is just doing distillation. You're just separating it out, and whatever the crude oil will give you is what you got. So you get that percentage of gasoline, you get that percentage of diesel. You don't have to do any further processing. These are fairly simple to set up, and so sometimes we see these set up for places like Nigeria, for example, where there's a lot of theft of crude oil. There's very simple distillation refineries set up just to get the fuels from that crude oil. All right, but the little more complicated ones, which are most of our refineries here in the US, tend to be these, our big refineries like on the Gulf Coast and here in California, tend to have a lot more steps of refining that can go on. And so the next step would be cracking. And there's different ways to do that with thermal cracking, use catalysts to make it more efficient. But the big idea is you're taking those big hydrocarbons that are less valuable and breaking them apart, sometimes adding hydrogen to bring them up to the quality of like gasoline, which is what we mostly want here in the US. So you're taking some of the thick stuff and making it lighter products. Desulfurization, there's different ways to do that. Some of it happens with the cracking. Some of it you can do separately. Again, you just want the sulfur out because when you burn the sulfur, it creates sulfur dioxide, acid rain, and we have restrictions on how much sulfur our fuels can have. And so you've got to take the sulfur out. And then the alkylation and the reformer, these are putting some of the molecules back together in different forms, often to increase the octane of your fuel. Again, it's all about making this high quality, usually gasoline here in the US. Other places like Europe, it would be more focused on making diesel. So most of the refinery products in the US are gasoline. So it's about half of what we're making in our refineries is going to gasoline. This is just kind of like I guess, a trivia or a fun fact. You actually get more gallons of product out than crude oil you put in. So this is called processing gain. And that's just because you're making it lighter by breaking them apart. You do add some hydrogen too, which also adds to the volume. So 42 gallons going in becomes 45 gallons of product coming out. So this comes up if you see the difference between production and consumption. It's because it's a little bit different volume when you look at those numbers. Okay, so what are the changes that are happening? Let's talk about some of the challenges and the changes that are happening with our fuels, and then really talk about our fuels. So one of them is gasoline use per driver in California is declining pretty quickly, and we're actually seeing it decline in the US post-pandemic. So miles have come back up, but gasoline usage is declining. And we'll start to see that more and more as there's electric vehicles, more efficient vehicles, other options, right? And so this is a challenge for those refineries that, again, are volume. They're volume related in terms of making profit margins. So what is happening here in California? We are starting to see some of our refineries switch from being just for gasoline and diesel from oil to more renewable fuels. And we'll talk more about renewable fuels when we get to biomass in the biofuels lecture. But these are basically using biomass resources to make diesel. When they talk about renewable fuels, they're really talking about diesel because we can make a diesel that looks just like oil diesel, but it's made from biomass resources. And so our refineries are changing their processes to make more of these renewable fuels. A lot of that is driven by demand, and a lot of it's driven by policy in California because we have a low carbon fuel standard that's driving down the carbon intensity of our fuels. So this is something we'll see going forward. I'm not going to read through this, but just wanted to give you a sense. Probably no surprise, refining is a big chemical operating facility. It has a lot of risks that have to be managed both from a safety, environmental, and health standpoint. So there's a lot of regulation of them here in the US, which is why nobody's building big new refineries. Really hard to cite. They're really just adding capacity or modifying existing refineries. I mentioned a little bit fence line communities. So fence line communities that we see next to big industrial sites like refineries, it is a challenge. It's a challenge for the communities, and it is a challenge for the refineries themselves. So I'm showing you just an example. This is the refinery I worked a summer at in Baton Rouge, where it is a predominantly black neighborhood where the refinery is located, and you can see the very Caucasian white neighborhood away from the refinery. This is right in the middle of Baton Rouge. It's right next to the river. So you can see the Mississippi River going through there. And this area is where Exxon has been trying to buy up land to create a green space between the community and the refinery. And so there's obviously lots of challenges. If you read that article, you can read more about it in terms of people don't want to sell their land or they've always lived there, that's their home. To the challenge for the refinery is they want a buffer. If something happens, they want time to respond before it impacts people that are living on their fence line. And so it becomes this point of tension, and we do see elevated health impacts along fence lines of places like refineries. More locally, this is Valero. They have a green space around the refinery, but you can see it's not that far to the community. And we do see community impacts. So oil spills are pretty obvious ones, but even most recently, they've found that Valero has been releasing benzene, which is carcinogenic, at levels that exceed allowed levels for 15 plus years. And so this does disproportionately impact those fence line communities. So it's one of the challenges. So thank you all for your attention.